Well, welcome, and I'm pleased to be joined by Professor Jacob Hacker. It is the 26th of May, 2020. We are speaking by Zoom in New Haven, Connecticut. It happens to be the morning that the United States just hit the grim milestone of 100,000 deaths to the COVID-19 virus, although as we all know, that's probably an undercount, but it's just a moment to mark where we are. Jacob Hacker is the Stanley Reeser Professor of Political Science and also the Director of the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale. He's the author of many, many books and articles on various aspects of inequality in America. Most recently, American Amnesia, How the War on Government Led Us to Forget What Made America Prosper, and Winner Take All Politics, How Washington Made the Rich Richer and Turned Its Back on the Middle Class. Welcome, Jacob, and thank you for taking the time this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Matthew.
You're one of the people I've really been eager to talk to since this crisis hit, because you've spent so much time thinking about inequality and plutocracy and populism, or faux populism, let us say, of the don't tread on me variety. And if you set aside the medical aspects of the current crisis, it's really in this country all about inequality, plutocracy, and faux populism. Before we get to the pandemic itself, maybe if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about your own work and your own analysis. If someone had asked you around the first of the year for your assessment of American society in terms of political economy and our politics, just give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch of your own work on that and your own analysis of that.
Sure. I'm actually in the process of putting out a new book, which was supposed to be published in about a week ago, and which our publisher has pushed back to July because of the pandemic. It'll come out around the time of the conventions, the presidential conventions. And the title of that book pretty well sums up my take on the present political economy. Let Them Eat Tweets is the title, with the subtitle, How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. And I think that it's absolutely clear now in the wake of this crisis that we're living in an era of plutocracy, by which I mean a system of government that is highly responsive to the rich and corporations and weakly responsive or non-responsive to the rest of Americans, and that is running mostly through, at least at present, the Republican Party. And Paul Pearson, my co-author, and I, who wrote this book and the other two you mentioned, American Amnesia and Winner Take All Politics, have been sort of struggling with this transformation of the Republican Party in our work for some time. And we did not see Donald Trump coming, but we did see the party going down this route that actually resonates with the historical experience of conservative parties in the early 20th century, as opposed to our present early 21st century. So if you go back roughly 100 years, conservative parties were grappling with this expanding suffrage. Workers were getting the right to vote. And as they did, they were having to figure out how to navigate their simultaneous need to appeal to working class people and maintain the support of their traditional economic elites in contexts of very high inequality. And what we argue is that the Republican Party has faced a similar kind of pincher movement of pressure over the last, as it has continued to remain closely allied with corporate elites and with big conservative donors who are putting record amounts of money into our political system. But it's also become more and more reliant on white working class voters to win elections. And the combination of this plutocratic and sort of populist pressure is in many ways the contemporary Trump-led Republican Party. And we don't think that was an inevitable outcome, because we actually describe a bunch of turning points when the party flirted with alternative paths. But as the party became tighter and tighter in its embrace of plutocracy, prioritizing tax cuts for the rich and deregulation over almost any other goal, it simultaneously had to develop a set of appeals and a set of allies that mobilized white working class voters. And each case that there was a choice, it chose, instead of choosing to sort of moderate on economics and broaden its electoral base to include non-white voters, particularly Hispanic voters, it went the other direction. It doubled down on plutocracy, and it doubled down on white voters, which meant it needed to reach deeper and deeper into the white working class as its primary source of support. And so it's a paradoxical feature of the contemporary GOP that it is populist in the way that we think of right-wing populism in other rich democracies, but unlike the right-wing populism of, say, the National Front in France, it's highly plutocratic. So other rich countries have right-wing populist parties that are welfare chauvinistic. They want to give lots of benefits to white citizens, and they don't just talk the talk, of supporting the working class. They actually walk the walk. But in the U.S., the walk in favor of working class interests is very short, and the talk is very loud.
As you look back across the last 2 generations or so of U.S. political history, the through line is pretty impressive. From the Southern strategy to Reaganism to the Gingrich Revolution to backlash politics in the Obama era to where we sit right now. I'm curious, you mentioned potential turning points, and what those inflection points are in your view, but also what you view as the kind of the point of no return in the becoming of the current day Republican Party.
Well, we say that historically conservative parties that have faced this dilemma of sort of dealing with the simultaneous desire to protect their plutocratic supporters and need to reach out to new working class voters, that the dilemma isn't always resolved in favor of something that looks like what we have today in the US, the plutocratic populism. The British Tories, for example, managed to modernize and sort of develop a set of themes that could resonate with working class voters, even as they maintain their conservative economic position. But I think the way we think about it is a lot like the famous story of Pandora's box, that once you open it up, it's really, really hard to close it. And you're right that in opening up Pandora's box, the Republican Party drew on a lot of the themes of the Southern strategy that Nixon had used. But there is something very different between the Republican Party of, say, Donald Trump and the Republican Party of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was on economic policy what you might call a red Tory, right? To go back to our British example, right? He supported a huge expansion of Social Security. He courted unions, so much so that the business community was always complaining that he was only paying attention to George Meany and other union leaders. He supported a guaranteed family income. He tried to pursue national health insurance, though not effectively. So the point is just that Nixon and Nixon's advisors wanted him to appeal to white voters and invoke, frankly, racist themes to do so. But they also believed that it would be a total disaster if he adopted a really conservative economic program. And so that changed. It changes really with Reagan, but even then, Reagan is really an outlier within his party. In Congress, the old guard, which stays in power really until Newt Gingrich takes over the party in the early 1990s, the old guard was not with the Reagan program. They voted and forced Reagan to accept tax increases after he slashed taxes in 1981. In a famous episode, Reagan's advisors floated Social Security cuts, and the Senate voted 100-0 against them. And so what happened to the Republican Party over this 1980 to mid-90s period is that it began to turn decisively right, and in doing so, it generated the beginnings of this sort of hyper inequality we face today. But it had not yet fully embraced plutocracy. And in a lot of ways, right, there wasn't the kind of inequality that would be the foundation for that embrace, right? It was just the economy was still relatively equal, but the decline of labor and the cut in top end tax cuts and the financial free-for-all in the corporate world, all of those drove up incomes at the top and suppressed or depressed them below the top. And so by the 1990s, the party was faced with a choice. And I think any choice that sort of evolves out of changing circumstances, it didn't seem like a clear one to many within the party. Gingrich wasn't totally on board with big business when he took over the party in 94. But once they were in power, they realized that they needed a lot of money to hold on to power. And they also, this is the congressional GOP, they also realized that there was just a great racket that could be run. They invested in trying to get lobbyists to move to the Republican side, to rewarding allies and punishing enemies, to building a big money machine. Tom DeLay, we now forget him. He only shows up, on Dancing with the Stars and in federal courthouses. But at one time, he was this master of the House who was creating the most formidable money machine in modern congressional history. So this period then saw the congressional party embrace plutocracy. And we think the decisive point where the presidential party, if you will, embraced plutocracy was the rise of George W. Bush in 2000. So one turning point, and then I'll stop, is the defeat of John McCain's insurgent presidential bid in 2000. McCain calls for a totally different program. Most notably, he doesn't have big tax cuts for the rich in his policy packages. He criticizes them. But that's, of course, Bush's big domestic policy priority. And revealingly, Bush buries McCain in South Carolina by bringing on board a lot of right-wing populist forces, Christian right and, frankly, racist groups to take down McCain, whom they smear as being the father of an illegitimate black child, when in fact he had adopted a child, Bangladeshi child, at the request of Mother Teresa. So just like to give you a sense, talk about twisting, talk about, misinformation. This is really modern disinformation. Politics is really getting perfected in this 2000s period.
Yeah, well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because I'm glad that you mentioned Gingrich and DeLay, because that moment seems to me to be a really important one. And there are two aspects of it that they represent different dimensions than the dimension of kind of political thought and what conservatism does or can mean. They're more strategic. One has to do with governing style. And it seems to me that with Gingrich, we get the beginning of, from Gingrich, Dennis Hastert, the so-called Hastert rule, never vote for anything that your own party isn't going to carry, up to Trump, who does not even pretend to preside over people who did not vote for him. Right? We get this governing style that it just really cuts off half of the country roughly, and pretend it's a kind of a nullification strategy, basically. And we saw that certainly with McConnell's treatment of the Obama agenda. So that's one dimension, is that kind of governing style. And the other is the media landscape that also begins in the 90s and just gets worse and worse with Fox News. That's a shorthand for a whole bunch of a kind of network of media outlets by now, but it really starts with Fox in the 90s, and that's another media project that stretches back to the Nixon years. But I wonder, in your view, how important are those two dimensions, the media piece and the governing style piece, alongside the kinds of shifts in conservatism that you're tracking?
They are absolutely fundamental. I do think we can, there's a tendency to lose sight of actual governance, not just governing style, but what politicians do when they have the power to change society in durable ways. And so a big part of our argument is that the hyper inequality we see in the United States, where the top 1% has seen its share of income double to more than 20%, while the bottom half of Americans have seen their share of income fall by half to around 10%, right? So that hyper inequality, and it's even more marked when you start to look at the very top, is substantially a result of government policies. We know that because no other rich country has this kind of inequality, certainly no other Western rich country. And we also know it because we can trace out the ways in which policies that have been pursued by Republicans, and to a lesser extent Democrats, who've been seeking the same business support and trying to outgun them in the policy fight, that these policies like deregulation of finance, the cut and top end tax cuts, the crushing of unions and others, that these policies are directly linked to the ways in which inequality, wealth and income inequality has risen. And I emphasize that because before we delve into style and rhetoric, it's really important to understand that for the contemporary Republican Party has pursued a really consistent set of highly conservative economic policies that are highly responsive to its organized billionaire backing and corporate backing, but not very responsive to many of those who vote for the Republican Party. So where does that kind of come in to the story that you're telling? Well, first of all, I think you cannot understate the importance of right-wing media. When Gingrich's new Republican Party takes control of the House in 1994, they hold this huge celebration in Camden Yards to talk about their new majority. And who is the guest of honor? Rush Limbaugh, whom they basically say is almost solely responsible for this. And Limbaugh, of course, is presaging Fox News, which rolls out in the 2000s. And there's just now abundant evidence from very careful political science and economics analyses that shows that Fox News has a very profound effect on people's voting patterns, on their perceptions of policy, and I think on the way the rest of the media has to operate in this new world in which you have essentially a highly partisan conservative, highly Republican, highly conservative source that plays by a very different set of rules and amplifies disinformation in a way that isn't true on the other side of the spectrum. And of course, under Trump, Fox News, after initially being skeptical of him, like many of the established organs of the party, has become essentially, state TV for Trump. Fox has essentially become state TV for Trump. So that is a powerful force in this story. And the governing style, I think, is an accompaniment to these governing priorities. So the most important thing to understand is that most of what Republicans are seeking is not very popular, right? These policies do not pull well, and they do not pull well even among Republican voters. A case in point, right? The two least popular pieces of legislation that we've seen over the last quarter century, according to a careful analysis by the political science Christopher Warshaw, were the two initiatives that Republicans pursued in 2017, the repeal and replace of the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, and the big tax cut legislation. Now, they narrowly failed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and they succeeded, of course, in passing their big tax cuts, unfunded deficit finance tax cuts for the rich, but neither of those were popular, and neither of them became centerpieces of Republicans' subsequent campaigns. In fact, 2018 reversals for Republicans were almost certainly a big part of the reason for those was the Affordable Care Act assault that they launched. Now, the point then is that if you have an unpopular agenda, unpopular even within your own party, you've got to figure out a way to keep your party ginned up. And so the style of governance you talk about, the kind of us versus them, denigration of government, sort of saying that Washington is the enemy, themes that get picked up by both parties in the sort of fray of electoral competition, that all is of a piece, right, with this agenda that's unpopular. So if you can get people to believe that government isn't working, and especially not working for them, then you can get them on board with an agenda that is rabidly anti-government. So when Grover Norquist, the anti-tax lawyer who pioneered the No New Taxes pledge of the Republican Party, when he said that he didn't want to get rid of government, he just wanted to get it down to the size that he could drown it in the bathtub. There are, lots of white working class voters who benefit enormously from government policies, not least Social Security and Medicare, who were cheering him on. So that's, I think, the story. It's about how these priorities, not popular within the country and even within the Republicans' own electoral base, have dictated a set of electoral strategies that are highly polarizing, tribalizing, and as we've seen during the COVID-19 pandemic, really at odds with effective governance. And I just think that what we're seeing now, I fear that every person sees in what's happening now a kind of confirmation of their priors. So I was struck by how quickly Republicans did respond by passing some important, or at least supporting some important policies to deal with the pandemic. Notably, the big expansion of unemployment insurance and the direct cash aid. Now, there was a lot of kicking and screaming on the way to that, and Republicans in turn demanded extremely plutocratic policies, including like hundreds of billions in unrelated tax cuts for rich people. But still, that was a huge juncture, and one where the party's kind of recognition that electoral survival was at stake helped drive its leaders to act boldly and in a way that was at odds with how they've been acting recently.
There was about a half a minute, it wasn't longer than a half a minute, where I thought, wow, we're all Keynesians now.
Of course, Nixon was the person who said that, which gives you a sense, right? It was Nixon, right, who was as I said, Nixon was to sort of pioneer a lot of the racially divisive strategies that the Republican Party, well, the Southern Democratic Party was a pioneer of these strategies, but Nixon picked them up in the 1960s. But he coupled that, as his statement, "We're all Keynesians now," suggests, he coupled them with, a very ambitious use of the federal government in the economic policy realm. Wage and price controls, for example. I didn't even mention those before. But now, you're right. I mean, the old joke is that there are no atheists in foxholes, and I like to say there are no libertarians in a pandemic. But Republicans did embrace an unprecedented package of spending in the immediate wake of the pandemic. But we have very quickly returned back to sort of the pattern of plutocratic populism, right? What are the Republicans' number one priorities now that they're demanding in return for any new relief? Well, they want liability relief for corporations. They want increased tax cuts that are completely unrelated tax cuts, extension of like tax incentives for depreciation and 3 martini lunches. And then in addition, they want to allow states and localities to suffer. The leadership at least thinks the post office should be allowed to go bankrupt. And if you go down the list, these are all extremely unpopular priorities. And they seem like at odds, not just with the Republicans' electoral base, which actually, if you look at the polling, is relatively supportive of many of them, but they seem at odds with the party's desire to stay in office. But I think it's really a sign of the extent to which the party has really gotten entrenched into a set of very conservative economic positions. And of course, that's the plutocracy. The populism, of course, is this ginned up controversy over stay-at-home orders and the use of incendiary appeals, whether it's the China virus or stirring up new and different kinds of anti-immigrant or anti-non-white appeals. That's really become at the heart of the campaign, which it looks like to me will be waged around sort of cultural and social backlash as opposed to economic governance.
As you describe the party, it almost sounds like an impossibility of their ever winning another election again. Although I think we all know that they could well win the next one. Who knows? But given the kind of disjuncture between the popularity of their overall agenda and their style here. So I guess 2 questions. One, I mean, obviously voter suppression is an important piece of this. I mean, that's
Yep.
one of the ways that you get this done is you really brace yourself for kind of straight ahead minoritarian governance. And we've been seeing that. But there is this fierce allegiance question. And I wonder, what's the language that you use in the classroom to explain this? I mean, what we're seeing in the pandemic is just a kind of shockingly total allegiance among this certain, whatever it is, 38%, to an agenda that we know really makes no sense for them. I mean, there's something, not only could it kill them in the context of the pandemic, but there's something so coercive about the employer protections, for example. I mean, that is just straight ahead, you go back to work, and no matter what the cost to you, you have to do that. It's shocking to me how blatantly coercive it is, but also how people seem to go along with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the election's still a long way off, but I think we can confidently say that the Republican Party is in a lot worse position now than they were before the pandemic. And I think there are really 2 parts to the answer. I think what you're really asking is sort of how do we explain the tribalization on the Republican side? And what Paul Pierson and I argue in the book is that it is extremely flexible, right? That's sort of the beauty of negative animus, not more by animus to the other side than by allegiance to your side, is that you can switch fairly easily from one set of enemies, the resistance to integration and economic advancement of African Americans, to another, the backlash against immigration, to another, which is the sort of sense of cultural grievance. A lot of this revolving around urban versus kind of rural identities. So, I think there's a lot of white status issues and gains at stake here. But I still think it's, as you say, a real puzzle how you can stick to such a narrow and relatively unpopular agenda and continue to get elected. And so, in addition to the tribalism, you already started to allude to the many ways in which Republicans engage in vote rigging to stay in power. And gerrymandering, where Republicans can turn narrow majorities into outsized majorities in state legislators, and it gives them a big edge in congressional races as well. And then there's, of course, the Senate, right, which is the most malapportioned upper chamber in the rich Democratic world, allowing solid red Wyoming to have the same number of senators as solid blue California. So there's a set of institutions that help make it viable. That said, even before the pandemic, the degree to which the Republican Party was in a race against time cannot be overstated, right? The party is on the losing side of like the two great changes in American society of the last 30 years. It's on the losing side of the growing diversity of the country, and it's on the losing side of the inevitable and kind of great inevitability of life, namely aging, right? That younger voters are much, much more skeptical of Republicans. So it's been to Republicans' benefit that they're, thanks to a lot of vote rigging, that they've been able to overcome their very poor showing among non-white voters and among younger voters, both actually non-white and younger voters being pretty low turnout voters, at least Hispanic non-white voters and younger voters being low turnout voters. So the party was in a race against time, and that of course makes us very worried, because there are really two ways in which this sort of dilemma can get resolved. One is that the party faces a lot of setbacks and has to figure out how to retool itself to be at least somewhat multiracial party and to be somewhat more moderate on economic issues. The other, of course, is that it goes farther and farther down this path of demonization and undermining democracy. And the peril isn't just the sort of well-known authoritarian threat that's posed by, say, a president who tries to get rid of elections or rig them in his favor. It's also this kind of counter-majoritarian threat that you already alluded to, where even though the majority of Americans vote for another presidential candidate and the majority of Americans vote for a different party in Senate elections, Republicans hold on to the presidency and the Senate.
Given, the work that you've done across 2 decades, I doubt that there is much that has surprised you in what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months. But if I ask the question, what does the pandemic teach? Are there things that you've seen in our social life, our political life, our media life in the last 4 months that have gotten you to think anew about some of these issues that you've been working on for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that there are at least two things that I think are both surprising and, if they lead to change, heartening. One is that I think we could overstate the degree to which the country is polarized over how to respond to this crisis. When you look at the polling, it's actually, there's an unusually high degree of agreement on the need for a gradual reopening that's attentive to public health concerns. There's support for helping out the post office, support for additional relief, support for help to states and localities. And these are not 50-50 issues. They're like 2/3, 1/3 issues. So I think that's a remarkable development. And indeed, I think in other countries, we've seen that where national political leaders of any party have responded relatively effectively to do those things that people think are going to save lives and minimize the economic fallout, that they've actually seen a big bump in support. It would have been possible, I think, if Donald Trump was a different person and the Republican Party and Mitch McConnell were different, that you could have seen a response that would have led to that. And that's, I think, actually kind of encouraging, right? It's not the big test of democratic responsiveness that when you have a huge national crisis, that if leaders respond somewhat well, that they get more support. That's not a very high bar for democracy, but at least it's a sign that democracy could work, and it's a sign that there are limits to American polarization. So I find that reassuring. I think the other thing I find reassuring, and that is when I look over the longer term in the U.S., I really do think that if we can keep our democracy relatively vibrant, and that's a huge if, that the trends I was talking about are going to lead to a shift in the center of political gravity. To me, I've been studying American economic inequality and insecurity for 25 years. And to me, the issues when I first started looking at them were kind of seen as problems about sort of a poor minority that needed help from a pretty well-off majority. Nobody thinks that way anymore. Trump voters certainly don't think that way. They think about there being a rich minority that is secure and that the rest of Americans are facing real hardship that needs to be addressed, and that government, if trust in government were to be restored to some extent, could address. And that's also encouraging to me. I mean, again, I'm a glass half full guy, and I look for silver linings, but I think there are some. That said, this is a moment of greatest peril our democracy has faced in my lifetime, and we should remember that there is nothing that guarantees that this great experiment in democratic self-government that the United States has been on for well over 2 centuries will continue. And to me, this calls on all of us to engage ourselves with these issues and to get involved in politics. And, I've been very careful with my discussions with my students to make clear that, that even though I'm very critical of the Republican Party, that the ultimate goal is to have a vibrant two-party system. Unless, we could create a multi-party democracy in the US, and I think that might be valuable, but I don't know if it's viable. Unless we go there for real accountability, we need two parties that want to govern, two parties that act responsibly, two parties that seek out the votes of relatively middle-of-the-road voters. That's what's going to get us back on a track that leads to shared prosperity. So I do think we're in a spot right now where the only path to that is a significant rebuke to the current governing coalition. But I hope that we can return to a world in which we have a robust two-party democracy that's working to produce what strong democratic government alone can produce in an interdependent world, which is shared prosperity and tackling the fundamental problems we face, from climate change to the challenges of providing opportunity and security in a transformed economic world.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that that's why I find some of the most compelling voices to me right now are not good old-fashioned leftists, but are people like David Frum and Nicole Wallace and Stephen Schmidt, who are still conservatives and identify as conservatives, but are just horrified at what they see before their eyes. And I think that I'm drawn to them because of exactly what you're saying about the necessity for this particular democracy of having at least a viable two-party system, if not a multi-party system.
I just wanted to highlight that one thing that I think I wish we had a better way to deal with is these counter-majoritarian features I've mentioned, because they really give a party that's out of step with the electorate a kind of refuge. The Supreme Court, for example, which has been stacked by Mitch McConnell in favor of Republican priorities, is going to be a counter-majoritarian force that is going to be shaping our politics for many years to come. And this is, to me, the problem is that if we're not careful, Trump's defeat does not defeat the kind of plutocratic populism that he represents. It is a very, very hardy strain at this point in the I don't want to use virus metaphors, but it's a very, very hardy part of American politics. And even if there are setbacks for it, it could well resurface because of these features of our political system that are so tilted in favor of extreme minorities.
Yes,
particularly this
it's
extreme minority.
yeah, no, it's institutionalized in 1,000 ways. I mean, one of the things, and this also, it goes back to something we were talking about earlier. It goes back to the Gingrich Revolution, which for me is really kind of where it starts, in the sense that that's where the Republican dream of one party rule seems to start. And I'm a little bit older than you are, but being of my cohort, I mean, the metaphor, and it's not even a metaphor really, but the word that I keep coming back to describe much of what we're seeing in our own politics is Soviet. There is this Soviet sense
Yeah.
of one party. The party is right no matter what. The party is supported by its own media. The party uses every lever of power as nakedly as it needs to get things done. I mean, I feel like this is all very, very familiar to me, having grown up in the '60s and having, heard the horror stories of what one party rule is all about.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly right to date the modern plutocratic populist, Republican Party to the Gingrich years, and that's indeed, I think, the core argument we make in the book is that it's that turn that Gingrich helps propel towards a politics that combines a reactionary economic program that is highly tilted toward the top and a reactionary cultural and social program that can get less affluent voters excited enough to keep voting for Republicans. It's that combination that Gingrich helps pioneer. And I think there are outlines of it well before that. We describe this not great, but telling memo by Lee Atwater, the architect of the Willie Horton ad, who was a young Reagan aide in '83 and wrote this long memo about how Republicans could get the South, which of course was still quite solidly Democratic. And his basic argument, and he used these words, was that you needed to get populists on board. And he said populists believe in government. They believe in robust action. What they don't want, I mean, he did not use these words, but it was clear what they don't want is to have equality with Black people. And he said, we need to learn a language. We need to talk about issues, cultural and social issues that can activate these voters without running afoul of, or at least too much afoul of, these modern norms of racial tolerance. Now, Trump has seen no need to use coded racial language, but I think that Atwater pioneered a way of talking about government that didn't have to use explicit racial language to racialize government and racialize the Democratic Party in a way that has had huge legacies for us as a country. So, I think that kind of toxic mix that was embodied in Atwater's memo and then crystallized in the '90s has deepened within the party over the last generation. And again and again, I think the root cause is the unwillingness to give up plutocracy, right? And let me just give you one example that I think is quite telling, which is in the late 2000s, the latter years of the Bush presidency, Bush gets reelected with 44% of the Hispanic vote, which is the modern high point for the party. And Bush, I think at that moment after his reelection, had a real opportunity to pursue immigration reform, something that he said he professed to support. What was his signature initiative when he came back into office? Well, we almost forget now because it was such a strange episode. It was privatization of Social Security. And it was only until, the tail end of his presidency, as Republicans looked to be in danger of losing the House and Senate, they did lose the House and then the Senate just barely when Barack Obama came in. It's only then that he started to push for immigration reform, and at a point at which his party was so cross-pressured by the coming election. And so that was another missed opportunity. So, you've got Bush, the beginning of the Bush presidency with the McCain insurgency, and the end of the Bush presidency with the potential for a different kind of Bush. Those two moments strike me as really fundamental. And, in 2013, the party again laid out in its so-called autopsy report, an alternative path that would rest on supporting immigration reform. But that, I think, comes very late in the story. And, there was no major candidate in the Republican primaries in 2016 who was willing to forthrightly get out there and make immigration reform a centerpiece of his or her campaign. It's all his, basically. And Donald Trump showed that, he could out-demonize these sort of mealy-mouthed Republicans and at the same time could faint toward the populist economic left on a lot of issues. But since he's been in office, he very quickly moved away from his promise of infrastructure investment and some of the other measures that were that he showcased that were supposed to help working class folks, and sort of let his administration be dictated by, and his priorities be dictated by, Mitch McConnell and the more conservative economic program of the party. So, we're back here in some ways at another juncture where the party is allied with deeply unpopular economic priorities, and its only real hope holding on in the fall is going to rest on making democracy work really badly and demonizing its opponents. And I'm hopeful, but hardly confident that this will not work. And as I said, I think both democracy and our, unity as a country, a unity that we need more than ever amid this pandemic, are what's at stake.
We've talked a lot about institutions, especially the parties, but other institutions. But at the level of kind of sociality, at the level of our quotidian day-to-day life with each other, at the level of culture, do you think that there's anything in this collective experience of working together to flatten the curve that, like looking back in 50 years, might we see this experience in the pandemic as a kind of turning point and something that did pull us together in ways that undid some of the atomization that have really characterized our social life over the last generation? Or do you think that that's a naive or romantic hope?
Well, I mean, it's certainly a romantic hope, but I think it's a hope for a potential reality. And to me, I think this is the greatest of, the most dramatic event of our lifetimes, of the sort of post World War II American experience, perhaps. And it will have huge effects across our economy, society, and politics. What I struggle with is figuring out exactly what those effects will be. I think its immediate effect has been to kind of reinforce some of the more destructive elements of our politics, and of course to devastate our economy. I do think that the most hopeful signs rest in the ways in which it has reinforced some sense of social solidarity. And as I said, we actually have more agreement on a lot of core issues surrounding the crisis than you might expect. But, I think there is no automatic process by which a society recalibrates in response to crisis. As in so much else, it runs through our democratic politics at all levels. And I think our political system is probably the weakest link in many ways in our society right now. It is the source of great potential, but also the source of great peril. And I am hopeful, but I wish I was able to ground my hope in a higher degree of confidence about what will happen next. All I can say is what I said before, which is that it really is in our hands in some deep sense to try to bring about a better response.
I mean, as you look at, this is Memorial Day weekend, or we're just coming off of a Memorial Day weekend, and we've seen a lot of media footage of, amusement parks in Missouri and beaches in Florida. I mean, people are really coming out. And I believe I'm with you when you say that the people who are full on against a lockdown is a tiny, tiny minority, the kind of people who are kind of taking to the streets to protest health policies that's a tiny, tiny fraction. But there is a significantly larger group of Americans who just really, for however they would articulate their reasons, are really eager to get out in the world, and they aren't particularly vigilant about how they're doing it. I guess one of the places that I'm led to as I observe all this in my own thinking is, whether it's in the fall or whether it's soon upon us, it does seem like another spike in our number of cases is going to be coming down the pike. Whether you want to call it a second wave or a second spike or whatever it is, I don't think this pandemic is just gonna go out with a whimper. And I guess my question for you is, if we have to endure another really significant, dramatic round with this disease, is it your sense that our response the second time around would be any different than what we've seen the first time around? Are we capable of being chastened by, this recent history and going a different way with it, or will we just see more of same when it comes to the kind of polarizations over policy?
Well, I think that I'm not very hopeful that we're going to see an effective response. I mean, let's just be clear. The response of the federal government, notwithstanding the speed with which a first relief package was put together, the response of the federal government has been catastrophic, right? And the US is not the only country that experienced this kind of death, but it's only a small handful that have gone through something so wrenching. And every institution that we had that was set up to deal with crises like this has been weakened or undermined over the long term and more recently. And President Trump has been a singularly ineffective, divisive, and frankly frightening figure during this crisis. So I can say all that, and as a result, I think it's, as you say, it's very likely we're going to see more deaths. Tragically, this 100,000 mark is only it's a way station in the unfolding of this national disaster. And where we'll end up, I think, is much, much harder to predict, and what the trajectory will be is much, much harder to predict. But we don't have to talk about second waves because many parts of the country have yet to experience their first wave, and they will. So I'm very worried about that. And I think there are two effects of that. I don't think they're going to call out a better response from our president or Senator Mitch McConnell. I think they have basically decided that shifting to a stance that we need to reopen the economy and attacking opponents and maybe playing up the possibilities of treatment and virus and a vaccine are basically what he needs to do, or what he wants to do, or he feels he is in a position to do. So I think there are two effects of that. One is that I think the Republicans, if things go really badly, the Republicans are going to face an even bigger backlash in the fall. But on the other hand, it also increases the confusion and turbulence and disorder that could well stand in the way of a free and fair democratic election. So I want to end on a happy note, but I think that we should all hope that we're fortunate enough that we don't have tens of thousands more Americans dying. It's just been a horrible, horrible situation. But if that comes to pass, I think it simultaneously increases the chance that we'll get new leadership and the chance that there will be, serious barriers to a well-functioning democracy in the fall. Take that as you will. That's a glass that's half full and half empty at the same time.
There you go. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel like we should have?
No, just that, all of us should stay safe and take care of ourselves, as well as get engaged on these issues and do what we can to change the course of our nation for the better, because as we're learning now, governance really matters.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I'm really appreciative, and you've been generous with your time. And as ever, it's great to hear your thinking.
Well, it's really great to talk, notwithstanding these tragic moments.
Yeah.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you.